just heard from the Minister of Unification, who gave us his overall view of the Park Geun-hye government's North Korea policy, and of course he is very concerned on the ongoing drivers on the peninsula. It's a real honor and a privilege to chair the first session on North Korea's nuclear capability. A number of new developments have occurred over the last 6 to 8 months that all of you are aware of. I just came back from a meeting in Washington and in New York, and some of my friends told me that, at least in the open source literature, there were some disturbing developments vis-a-vis the DPRK's nuclear weapons program. I don't think the Asan Institute could have gotten a panel that is as distinguished and informative as it is today. And although my dear friend, Dr. Ham Jae-bong, the president of the Institute, is here, as well as the newly minted vice president, Dr. Jiyoung, who's had 20 plus years in various institutions here in Korea, I think the Asan has done a huge favor for the policymaking community here and abroad to review key benchmarks on this issue. I'm sure that all of you have read the biographies of our four speakers, but just briefly, there's been a slight change in the order of presentation. We'll go with Dr. Park Jiyoung. She just recently joined Asan. She's a director of the Science and Technology Policy Center at the Asan Institute. Previously, she was managing director of R&D Feasibility Analysis Center at the Korea Institute of S&T Evaluation. And unlike most of us in the political science division, she really knows what she's talking about. She has a PhD in nuclear engineering and radiological sciences from the University of Michigan, which is a very good school because my daughter goes there. Number two, we have Mr. Joshua Pollack. He's a senior analyst at SAIC, and he was previously an associate at DFI International. And he looked very familiar to me, and he introduced himself, and he said, "I am Jonathan Pollack's son." And so this is a real icing on the cake. Jonathan and I used to be colleagues at the RAND Corporation back in the 1990s, so it's a real pleasure to see you. And of course, your father is well known to almost every single person in this audience. Third, we have Mr. Markus Schiller. Dr. Markus Schiller is a senior analyst at Schmucker. Technologie is a consulting company in Munich, Germany, which means he makes more money than the rest of us. He was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation, another Randite, and a project engineer at Schumacher Technologie. He currently teaches at the Technical University of Munich. Last but not least, Dr. Lee Bin. He's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also concurrently professor at Tsinghua University in China. He's done a number of works on China's nuclear arms control programs. He previously directed the Arms Control Division at the Institute of Applied Physics and Computational Mathematics, and was also a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. So I'm sure that all of you will be able to read their bios in greater detail. So I guess, so let's begin with the first speaker, who will be Dr. Park Jiyoung. If you could spend for about 10 minutes, and if you go over time, I will stop you.
Okay.
No, the only reason being because we have so many great experts in the audience, I'm sure that they will want to be engaged fully with the audience. So once again, on behalf of Asan and our great friends, Dr. Ham Jae-bong, Dr. Jiyoung, welcome, and Dr. Park, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For recent years, we have faced surprising news from North Korea about their capability and in the missiles and nuclear weapons technology programs. However, there are a huge amount of uncertainties regarding its weapon development program and its capacity. How large is North Korea's uranium enrichment program? How much could it make weapon-grade uranium in the future? Or how much weapon-grade plutonium can be made or produced inside North Korea? And what is the technology they are using to make nuclear explosion? And how should we respond to these uncertainties? There is no doubt that they have active nuclear weapons program. They possess three components of nuclear weapons, which can be a significant menace to regional and global stability and peace. To be considered as a serious threat, they must have fissile materials, technology to assemble the bombs, and a delivery system. As to the fissile material, it is known that North Korea has natural uranium ore, which can be distilled into the highly enriched uraniums using their own uranium enrichment facilities. It is also known that they have a capability of producing weapon-grade plutonium using its own facilities. And the facility is suspected of having been reoperated recently after a temporary shutdown. North Korea conducted 3 nuclear tests, and the last nuclear test was on February 12, 2013. The type of the third nuclear test has not been declared for yet because there is limited information on the North Korea's nuclear capability. The estimated explosion yields are varied from several kilotons to 40 kilotons because of a series of assumptions in calculating North Korea's nuclear test. The estimation cannot be guaranteed. And while it is believed that the previous 2 tests used plutonium as the fissile material, it is speculated that the third test involves uranium device. However, it is still unclear because monitoring efforts to detect radioactive isotopes have failed. We know where the facilities are for the plutonium production in the North Korea, since there are lots of intelligence signatures such as satellite data. Therefore, from this point of view, it is reasonable that North Korea pursue technology that they can hide concerning about survivability of their nuclear infrastructure for producing fissile materials. We know that they obtained design know-how from Pakistan, and they have operated enrichment program. They obtained enrichment devices through procurement networks and are considered to be able to replicate them, which would not be a terribly challenging task for them. They employed implosion technology for the first 2 tests, which technology may be more difficult to produce. But North Korea has been at this technology for a while and should have achieved a certain level of technology. Therefore, it would not be over-concerning to worry about their interest in thermonuclear technology under the condition that they are capable of possessing highly enriched uraniums and weapon-grade plutoniums at the same time. Miniaturization of nuclear warhead to mount on a missile is one of the deep concerns regarding North Korea's nuclear capability. Success of the miniaturization of nuclear bomb will allow them to load the ballistic missiles North Korea has, and it may cause serious regional and global security problems. In particular, this is the most significant criteria for now to measure the progress of the development. When it comes to North Korea's missile capability, they have diverse connections and cooperative partners in development. Most experts have suspected that among them are 2 countries, Iran and Pakistan. As in the case of AQCON network, the connections of North Korea with both countries are not limited to nuclear development, but also linked to missile development. We should pay close attention to the direction of North Korea's nuclear development. Some experts point out the current nuclear development of North Korea lies in sustaining its own regime, the so-called powerful and prosperous nation and military-first ideology. Likewise, it can be the most pivotal means of negotiation with the United States to reduce military threats and maintain economic assistance. We don't really know the reason why they are seriously into the nuclear weapons program, whether it's because there is an internal power struggle, or they are trying to get paid off through it, or maybe they are just trying to test neighboring countries. Anyhow, it seems that they are trying to present as many threats as possible, and it is likely that North Korea will try to go beyond its current capability despite all the sanctions and restrictions on technology transfer from the international society. If North Korea is able to improve its long-range ballistic missiles, the United States mainland might be added to the target list. Also, it is reasonable that North Korea will try to develop a solid fuel capability, since it will allow them launch on warning rather than detected while fueling when they use liquid fuel. Even though they are not standing at the completing stage of this program, there is little to block them from developing nuclear capabilities. If they need time, money, and several more tests to upgrade their nuclear weapon to a small and sufficiently accurate weapon, they can take advantage of indifference from international community, even if the indifference is affected. Cost for technology development should be much lower than those of capitalist nations. Rough cost estimates for developing space launching vehicle for Republic of Korea shows that over 20% of the total cost goes to human expenses or indirect costs. Even among other parts, we can assume that cost for assembling, test and verification, cost for quality control should be much less in North Korea when we compare those with ROK or any other countries. And they don't even need engineering costs paid to private sectors. They have established the research institute for the weapons program, and they already have dedicated scientists and engineers to the weapons program. And they are not distracted to their own academic achievements or commercial rewards from publishing theses or applying patents. All they need is catching up technology or replication. Underground tests can be replaced by simulations and detonation tests, if not all. They already conducted over 140 high explosive detonation experiments. Currently, it seems that North Korea still remains dependent on foreign supply for its weapons program, and its procurement for this program are ongoing. However, nuclear technology is no longer state-of-the-art. Export control alone cannot prevent North Korea from developing nuclear technology in the long term. They are not at the beginning of this process. They have been at it for a long period of time. We have to continue analyzing North Korea's activities through various channels of information, and we should work out a more effective way to prevent them, or at least delay them from developing weapons technology. Should we wait for another nuclear test or missile launch to confirm their capability? It depends on how close they are and how to prevent them to get closer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park, not only for your lucid comments, but also for keeping your time. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Joshua Pollack.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And thanks to everyone for joining us this morning, and to Dr. Han Jae-bong and Dr. Jiyoung and the Asan Institute for the very gracious invitation to speak today. My presentation is based on collaborative research that I've undertaken with Dr. Scott Kemp of MIT.
Can you speak closer into the microphone?
Certainly. My presentation is based on collaborative research that I've undertaken with Dr. Scott Kemp of MIT. Today, however, I am speaking purely for myself and not for my employer or its sponsors. I would like to describe this morning evidence that North Korea has been working on the technology for producing the crucial components for gas centrifuges inside North Korea, as opposed to just importing them. As many audience members are aware, gas centrifuges are a technology for the enrichment of uranium, and highly enriched uranium can be used to make nuclear weapons, as Dr. Park just explained. there are some serious implications if North Korea is able to produce its own gas centrifuges without significant dependence on outside suppliers. The first implication is that some of the best developed preferred policies of the international community to block or slow down the North Korean nuclear program may be of greatly reduced effectiveness. Specifically, export controls, sanctions, and interdiction. Interdiction meaning stopping shipments to attempt to enforce sanctions. If the North Koreans are making the most important components at home, those tools clearly cannot stop them. And this is important because sanctions and interdiction have become the international community's favored tools for addressing the North Korean nuclear program over the last decade, starting with the Proliferation Security Initiative of 2003 and gathering political momentum and legal force with a series of UN Security Council resolutions since that time. The second implication of this development is that the countries who are opposed to nuclear proliferation in North Korea and in general will not very easily be able to track the expansion of North Korea's nuclear program by monitoring sensitive imports. Again, if they're not undertaking those sensitive imports, you won't see them happening. So we'll be surprised. The third implication is because of the nature of centrifuge technology, it will be difficult to know exactly where enrichment activity is taking place inside North Korea. Dr. Pock referred to this in her talk. This is technology that uses relatively little electricity, does not produce a great deal of heat, so it does not have, let's say, a signature associated with it that is very special. It does not announce itself the way that a nuclear reactor would or a way that certain other uranium enrichment techniques would. So, let's briefly review what's been known about North Korea's gas centrifuge program until now. Since at least 2002, it has been believed that the North Koreans were working on a gas centrifuge program based on technology received from Pakistan, as we just heard. But there were doubts about how much progress they had made. Then, in late 2010, the North Koreans invited 3 American visitors to the Yongbyon nuclear facility, including Dr. Siegfried Hecker, a former director of Los Alamos National Labs. And they showed to the Americans a new advanced gas centrifuge plant at Yongbyon. Now, this year, it appears that North Korea is expanding that plant. This April, the North Koreans announced that they would adjust and alter the uses of the nuclear facilities at Yongbyon, including the enrichment plant. And commercial satellite images from this July, which you can see online, have showed that the building has recently been doubled in size. So these events in 2010 and 2013 were surprising because there have been very few indications of sensitive imports. According to news media reports and unclassified US government reports, North Korea was detected importing large amounts of centrifuge-related parts and materials for a period of roughly 4 years from around 1999, maybe a little earlier, through around 2003. These included some goods that are relatively scarce, that are hard to make, and that are hard to substitute for. But after 2003, these crucial imports don't seem to be observed. So you have to ask yourself, how can the North Koreans build a new centrifuge plant, or now expand it, without importing these sensitive technologies from more advanced countries? There's more than one possible answer, but I believe the most likely answer is by producing the necessary components and materials at home. Working with Dr. Kemp, who is an expert on centrifuge technology, I have found evidence for domestic production, or research on domestic production, I should say, of 6 key items inside North Korea. This evidence appears in North Korean scientific publications and in political publications and broadcasts. We searched for evidence of the production of these crucial goods, again, those that are scarce, those that are hard to make and hard to replace with a substitute. There are 6 areas for the technically inclined that we believe fall into this category. The first is uranium hexafluoride, also called UF6. This is the uranium-bearing gas that is fed into the centrifuges and is actually enriched. The second are vacuum pumps. These are the pumps that remove air from the centrifuges and the connecting pipes before the UF6 gas is fed in. The third are ring magnets. These are strong magnets made from samarium cobalt alloys that can be used as the top bearings in gas centrifuges. What that means is that they hold up the spinning component inside the centrifuge, the rotor. And because they hold it with magnetic force, it can spin with minimal friction. These magnets are also special because they resist the corrosive effects of the UF6 gas. Fourth is frequency inverters. These are electronic devices that control the speed of the electric motor that sits in the base of each centrifuge. They allow for the computerized control of modern centrifuge facilities like the one observed at Yongbyon in late 2010. The fifth is maraging steel. This is an extremely hard steel alloy that can resist high rotational speeds. The rotor of the P2 centrifuge, which is believed to be the type used in North Korea, uses maraging steel rotors. Sixth are CNC flow forming machines. CNC, or computer numeric controlled flow forming machines, are specialized lathes that produce very strong metal cylinders or other elongated symmetrical shapes. And the rotor in a centrifuge is cylindrical. It is difficult to produce a maraging steel rotor for a P2 centrifuge except with a flow forming machine. So, what evidence did we find in these 6 areas? In one case in particular, the evidence is especially strong and clear. It consists of photographs of at least 3 generations of flow forming machines inside North Korean factories. These photographs have appeared on North Korean television in recent years. Because I wasn't aware that PowerPoint was an option, traditionally it's not at Asan conferences, I put the photographs online at www.armscontrolwonk.com. That last part is W-O-N-K, in case you're wondering. So you can find the photographs and a detailed explanation there. Please look at it after the panel. In another area, maraging steel, the evidence I would say is more suggestive, less definitive. The evidence for maraging steel production includes accounts of iron and steel making inside North Korea that are fairly detailed and are consistent with maraging steel production, but don't describe the final step of the maraging steel process. So there's a missing piece from the technical accounts in North Korea, and we can't be quite as certain about this. But I can say that the establishment of these processes, called juche iron and juche steel, was one of the top priorities of the North Korean regime for over a decade, alongside space technology and CNC technology. In late 2009, Kim Jong-il was quoted in the North Korean media as describing the completion of the juche iron process as a victory greater than the success of a 3rd nuclear test. I think that's suggestive. Now, in the other 4 cases, UF6 production, vacuum pumps, ring magnets, frequency inverters, we found scientific reports and patent awards describing work towards domestic production. Time is limited, so I will not rehearse them in detail. But looking across all 6 areas, it appears that the research towards a domestic production capability was complete or largely complete no later than 2009. And again, partly because of the maraging steel piece, we don't have all the evidence, but that's the general picture, and it's pretty good evidence on the whole. So, it's less likely that less important goods are made in North Korea. I suspect they still import some things that are a little easier to come by. It's also possible that some of the raw materials for the specialized crucial components are imported. I don't think it would make sense for them to produce absolutely everything. North Korea is a country of limited resources, and it does at least make sense to manufacture the most crucial goods inside the country precisely so the vigilance of the international community cannot stop their nuclear program. So let's conclude. If it is the case that North Korea is already making the crucial components for centrifuges inside the country, then current policies based on export controls, sanctions, and interdiction have probably reached the limits of their effectiveness. If this is the case, then we cannot easily stop the expansion of the enrichment program. We can't even reliably detect its expansion. And we'll have serious difficulties trying to find all the locations where enrichment plants might be inside North Korea. We won't necessarily see anything more than what the North Koreans want us to see. That raises serious questions about whether there is or can be a viable strategy for nuclear rollback. If a denuclearization agreement is reached with the North Koreans, either soon or in the more distant future, we have to ask ourselves, how can it be verified? Will the international community be satisfied if it's not allowed to search for enrichment plants beyond Yongbyon and wherever else the North Koreans might declare they have nuclear facilities? Or will North Korea be willing to allow searches anywhere at any time? I have my doubts. Under these circumstances, our choices are less than ideal. And I know this does not come as welcome news. But we still do have options. And we still can make the best choices possible under the circumstances. One possibility is, instead of focusing on completely stopping uranium enrichment, and I know I'm not the only one who argues this, we could pursue in the near term an agreement that there will be no more nuclear tests or rocket launches. That way, they might produce more highly enriched uranium, but they would not be able to advance the quality of their weapon systems. We also could pursue an agreement of no more exports of nuclear technology to other countries, like Syria. These agreements would be easier to verify than a complete freeze on enrichment under the circumstances. In the case of rocket tests and nuclear tests, you can't miss them. In the case of exports, you might miss them. But that's where perhaps keeping sanctions and interdiction in place could continue to be of help, is on the export side rather than the import side, especially if there is an agreement not to export, because then they would have something to lose if they got caught at it. These may be our best options while the North Korean regime still stands. And unfortunately, while it stands, we may be forced to live with a nuclear North Korea. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very sobering analysis, because if even partially what you say turns out to be true, I believe that from the policymaking community, we are walking on slippery slopes, because if you're faced with accepting even partially a nuclearized North Korea, that is basically a no option as far as I'm concerned, but that is one possibility that people will be thinking about, given the fact that export sanctions and these other externally driven policy tools, as you suggest, might have been overcome by domestic nuclear technology. Let me then turn to Dr. Markus Schiller. Dr. Schiller, can you speak? Yeah,
yes.
That's fine.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Asan Institute and Dr. Ham for giving me the chance to share my thoughts with you here today. We are here today to talk about the nuclear capability. And as you will notice later during my remarks, I am not a nuclear expert, but a rocket scientist, an engineer by training. And you will notice that during some remarks about the delivery systems. So let me start with a story that I heard in August from a Russian professor. I attended a talk of a Russian professor, and he talked about nuclear proliferation. And he told a story that at the end of the Cold War, both the Americans and the Soviets were quite surprised that both sides had no plans for a first strike. Both sides had only planned for retaliation, and everybody was afraid of the other one striking first and attacking his own country. So that was a big surprise. And thinking of the crisis that we had earlier this year with North Korea, I cannot help but start thinking if that's just some kind of history repeating. And to find that out, we need a factual and analytical approach. And there's this wonderful tool of threat analysis and threat assessment that we can use for that. The crisis was indeed frightening, but fear is only reasonable when there's a real threat. And let me start with a hypothesis. And I was very careful with the wording of that hypothesis. I would say that there's little doubt that North Korea has the capability of exploding a nuclear device. This means actually they have the capability of making proof of concept tests, a laboratory scale, but we will talk about that later. The questions that are derived from this hypothesis are, can this device be used as a weapon? And the second important question, under what circumstances will it be used? So let's start with the analysis. And I would say that the first question has to be divided into two parts. First, the weapon or device itself, and second, the delivery system. Because it's kind of trivial, but every weapon has to be delivered to the intended target, else it is not useful. So talking about the weapon or the device or whatever we want to call it, it's very hard, as we have already heard from Dr. Park and Dr. Pollack, to say anything with substance about the status of the weapons program, nuclear weapons program in North Korea. I can't tell you anything new about that. As I said, I'm not a nuclear weapons expert, but I can tell you that an engineering truth has always been true for complex machinery. That's Murphy's law, every engineer knows that. And it states that if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. And that's also the case with every complex machinery on the planet. And you will always have something going wrong when you want to use that machinery. That's true for missiles, for airplanes, for everything, also for nuclear weapons. And laboratory scale is not a war. In wartime, you have very different requirements for the use of a weapon. So let's talk about the delivery system. As I said, you have to deliver the weapon to the target, and this task gets more and more complicated with the distance that you have to deliver the weapon to. So looking at the US or Europe, any very distant target, there actually only are two means for North Korea to deliver a weapon to those regions. This is either by missile or by terror attack. And I would say that it's quite unlikely that in the case of a full-scale war between North Korea and anyone else on the world, that North Korea manages to smuggle a nuclear device into, say, American city and detonate it there. So the only option in case of war is an ICBM. And I talked to a Ukrainian engineer in August who was working for Yuzhnoye, and he had hands-on experience on the SS-18 and SS-24, and I just asked him how credible is it that North Korea could have an ICBM in the next 5 years. And his reaction was, and he said no. So he thought it was totally impossible for North Korea to get that missile. Right now, according to my research, I'm also very sure that there is no current ICBM threat out of North Korea. We can talk about the future later. But let's look at the regional actors. Within the region, we have Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea that are also under the theoretical threat of a nuclear weapon attack from North Korea. And if you look at these regional actors, an attack by aircraft seems quite unlikely, I would say, but still possible. I just remember the story of Iraq, that the Iraqis tried to send during the 1990s, during the Gulf War, they tried to send some MiGs toward Israel to see if they can penetrate the air defenses. And from what I've heard, they were shot down the moment they left the Iraqi airspace. So this seems to be unlikely because air superiority without doubt will be at the Allies, at the US, at the Republic of Korea, but not North Korea. But let's still keep in mind that it's still possible because the distances are very small. Next option would be missiles. North Korea certainly has Nodongs available, Scuds available, even more short-range missiles, Luna, something like that. Putting a nuclear weapon on top of a missile is always a risky endeavor, especially if you have only very few nukes that are very precious to you. I would not take that risk for delivery, but we cannot exclude that either. And then we still have the option of ground delivery, at least to South Korea and to China, because of the common borders. They could place a nuclear weapon in a truck, in a tank, and just drive across the border. That would be something like a huge suicide attack. And again, that's terrorist attack, still possible. How likely? I don't know. But we have to say that North Korea right now seems to have the capability for exploding a nuclear device at South Korean territory in theory. But do they have the intention to do that? And that leads us to the second question. Under what circumstances will they use a nuclear weapon? And the German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz developed an approach that can help us here. He said, usually you have to postulate a strategic goal. You have to think of what you want to achieve in the end. After you have figured that out, you can think how to get there. From that, you derive some short-term tactical objectives, and then you think about the means to achieve these tactical objectives. So if North Korea uses its nuclear weapons against targets in South Korea, what does it mean in the long term? I think it's pretty clear to them as well as to us what will happen after a nuclear strike on South Korean territory, or even any other territory on the planet. It won't be a question like it is in Syria right now, who used a nuclear weapon actually, as who was the first one who used it. It will be pretty clear. And what then? And I would say that there's no strategy behind a nuclear strike from out of North Korea. Because after that, the leadership will be removed, it will be total war against North Korea, and I'm pretty sure that they are well aware of that. It is important in that context to think about the real use of nuclear weapons. They are not a tool for winning wars, for fighting wars. They are more a tool of last resort, of deterrence. And that has always been that way. It has been that way during the Cold War. It still is that way between India and Pakistan and other nuclear states. Even the first use in 1945 was to end a war and not to start a war or to bring a war towards a certain direction. It was the use of the weapon to end a war and avoid the invasion of Japan. Interesting enough, this political dimension of nuclear weapons that is huge is mirrored in North Korean behavior and in the North Korean missile program. It looks like the North Korean missile program is a political tool, and for me it looks just the same for the nuclear weapons program. So as consequences, we have to say that yes, North Korea probably could detonate a nuclear device within the region, but success is not assured for that. It is close to impossible for North Korea right now to do that beyond the region. We have to think what happens after the nuclear strike, and I'm pretty sure that North Korea also thinks about this question. Nuclear weapons are political weapons. The missile program in North Korea mirrors that. Both are more of a political signal, not only an external signal, but especially a domestic signal within North Korea to show strength within the region, for the regime, political strength to keep them in place. We should avoid being surprised like the Soviets and Americans were, and I hope someday the day will come that South Koreans can talk about North Koreans about the initial plans they had in case of a war, and I hope they will have the very same surprises. But this doesn't mean that North Korea is harmless. It's still dangerous. The conventional dimension is still there. Provocations can always happen, like happened during the past years, and we should have that as the main priority in our policies toward North Korea, to avoid provocations and losses of life in that dimension. We should continue close observations, we should focus on avoiding conventional war, but we should see nuclear weapons as what they primarily are, as politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Markus Schiller. You're a bit more optimistic on North Korea's WMD programs, and so I think those points will be taken by the audience. But I doubt highly whether the ROK and the US are going to base their deterrence policy on the assessments of a Ukrainian rocket scientist. Nonetheless, last but not least, I think, Dr. Liebin, you're going to use a PowerPoint? Right. So why don't I ask the panelists to go down to the audience, and then we'll see Dr. Liebin's presentation, and then come back up to the podium. Thank you. That's okay.
First of all, let me thank the Asan Institute for inviting me here to share with you my research on the North Korean nuclear weaponization and how they pursue a nuclear weaponization program. I'm sorry, I have to use a PowerPoint slide because it's a little bit complicated to explain the details. I'm going to explain my understanding about the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear weaponization. The question I'm going to ask is whether or not North Korea can militarize its nuclear devices for its missiles. And to answer this question, I try to answer another question. That is, what is the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear weaponization? This is a typical model of an implosive device. We assume that the North Korean nuclear devices are implosive ones. This is a metal shell. And inside, this is a chemical explosive. And this is the fissile material core. Sometimes we call this part as pit. And this is a neutron source. In the nuclear explosion, we first explode the chemical explosive and then create pressure and to press the fissile material core, and the fissile material core and the pit will reach super critical status, and the neutron source release neutrons to initiate chain reactions, and then the pit, the fissile core, will have chain reactions and release energy. And then the fissile material explode. No matter how much fissile material you use, I mean, you cannot use too little. But even you use more fissile material, you cannot get larger yield. Usually half kilometer or 1 kilometer fissile material will have fission and then release energy of 10 to 20 kilotons. So, in any case, the amount of fissile material does not change much from the first implosive bomb to very advanced fission device. For example, the Fatman, the implosive nuclear weapon dropped in Japan, has had about the same amount of fissile material as some much more advanced fissile material fission devices. So, the so-called miniaturization task does not include much of this part. This part is always about the same for the first bomb until a very advanced bomb. Usually, this part, the chemical explosive, is much bigger in the first bomb than an advanced bomb. So the physical core does not change much. But the scientists, if they do some nuclear tests, they understand that how to transfer energy from the chemical explosive to the physical in a more efficient way. So for that reason, they do not need that much fissile material. They could reduce the amount of, they do not need that much chemical explosive. They could reduce that. And then they know exactly how much chemical explosive they need. So they do not have to leave a big redundancy. For all these reasons, they could reduce the amount of chemical explosive and use very little at last. So this is a miniaturized device. This is how miniaturization works. Most, I would say, all other nuclear armed states, began with a conservative design. That is, to leave a lot of chemical explosive in the device in their first nuclear tests. And then after they got experience with their nuclear weapon design, they reduced the amount of chemical explosive and got a small device. So, but for North Korea, my assumption is that they chose a very different design. They began with a small device, with a small amount of chemical explosive. And then, they did their first test. It was not so successful. They had to add some more chemical explosive. And then still the yield was not good enough. They add some more chemical explosive. So eventually in their third nuclear test early this year, they got a full yield in the test. But the device is no longer small enough for their missile. That is my conclusion. Then we have some questions. Why they chose a risky design rather than a conservative design? This is my guess. For all other nuclear armed states, they had time. They knew that they could do more nuclear tests to improve their design. But for North Korea, they did not have that confidence. When they prepared for their first nuclear test, they had a very small fissile stockpile. They did not know whether or not they could afford many nuclear tests. They did not know whether or not the political environment of the international community would allow them to do many nuclear tests. So they had to prepare a risky design, meaning that they use very little chemical explosive in their first device, but they failed. So they had to change their priority. That is to make sure that they could reach a normal yield of 10 to 20 kilotons. And then they had to add more chemical explosive in their nuclear devices. So my conclusion is that, in the last 3 nuclear tests, they could not finish their task of meteorization, but they should have learned some experience. And if they have a chance to do more nuclear tests, maybe one more, they would be able to have a small and more reliable nuclear device for their nuclear missile. So it's important for us, to stop them from doing so. And also, because my assumption here is that they use plutonium in their 3rd nuclear test. If they used uranium in their 3rd nuclear test, it would be more difficult for them to do their job. The reason is that the critical mass of a uranium bomb is larger than a plutonium bomb. So that does, my assumption, does not change the conclusion much. So that's my speech. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee Bin, and I'm sure you will share your sources with your Korean friends after the conference is over. Because we began at 9:50 a.m., Dr. Ham, with your permission, can we proceed with session 1 until 11:15? That will leave us with a few minutes for coffee. Would that be all right? Because I did want to bring in the audience. And so since there are no official discussants on this panel, basically the audience is more than welcome to speak. Please direct your remarks specifically at one of the panelists. And in many cases, as I found, when you ask questions, it turns out to be a mini speech. But given the fact that we have limited time, please identify yourself and then ask specific questions to one or more of the panelists, and then we'll just go down the line. Maybe I'll collect about 3-4 questions, and then we can then proceed. So please, the floor is open. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. To Dr. Pollack and Dr. Park, from your perspectives, what are the key things to look for going forward in the future? What are the big steps that you're going to be looking for in terms of North Koreans' stages of progress? I know you said, Dr. Pollack, that your point is it's going to be very hard to judge from the outside, but what are you looking for? And then to Lee Bin, when the U.S. and China Joint Chiefs of Staff met, the Chinese general made a comment about predicting that there would be a 4th nuclear test. I'm just curious if that was reported, it was a public statement, but I haven't read much insight into, where that was coming from. But I'd be curious, given your expertise on this process of the series of tests, where you think the thinking is coming from on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. James Kim from the Asan Institute. My question is for Dr. Schiller. Earlier this year in Seoul, we had another conference where you had given us an assessment of the latest rocket launch, the test of the rocket launch from North Korea, based on the recovery of the parts. From what I recall, if memory serves me right, you seem to have suggested that the technical capability for long-range delivery was possible based on the assessments that you've had from those parts. If I'm incorrect, and please do correct me. If I'm right, then am I hearing something different here based on what you're giving us?
Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you. I am Vishnu Prakash, the Ambassador of India. My question is to Mr. Pollack. You made a very interesting case about what North Korea is doing and in terms of their own R&D capabilities. Now, having said that, you said that essentially the world has two options. One is to ensure or have an agreement with North Korea that they don't conduct another test, and second is that they don't export. Now, I frankly think that I wonder whether these are at all bankable guarantees or anyone can be assured that such agreements can hold. So essentially they are non-options. So do I hear you right from what you may say? I see that the world has essentially two choices as per what you are saying, either to embrace the inevitable or to try to defer the inevitable. Do I hear you right?
Okay, so Dr. Park, do you want to?
Well, what should be the signal of their technology level? Well, if they test one more time, it will give us a little about the information on their technology level and technology capability. But as I told you, and Dr. Pollack already mentioned that sanction does not work very well. And the nature of technology is when it is easy to get the materials or technology easily, they don't need to develop it. But if the sanctions goes to the North Korea and they cannot get materials or technologies, they will develop it by themselves. So we have to prevent them from the next test for all the pressure from using all the pressures from the other surrounding countries.
I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit. What might we expect next? Well, based on commercial satellite photographs that have appeared in different analyses on the World Wide Web, it now appears that the North Koreans have followed through on their promise of April 2nd to adjust and restart facilities at Yongbyon. They have doubled the floor size of the enrichment plant, and they appear to have restarted the plutonium production reactor. The next step, in my educated guess, would be to show us what analysts sometimes call the ground truth, to bring a trusted set of eyes inside the facilities so they can use them to bargain with us and to put pressure on us to come to the table more on their terms. In the failed Leap Day deal of February 2012, they made an agreement to bring International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to Yongbyon to monitor a freeze at both of those facilities. I suspect they will try to take up a version of that deal in the near future, and they may also attempt to exhibit these facilities to us through more informal ad hoc means, which they've done in the past. So that's the next thing I would look for. That's what I would expect.
Yes, you're right. In February, I stated that the unha missile or rocket, let's call it a rocket, is capable of reaching the US mainland, technically. That's correct. That hasn't changed. And we have some more information now about the unha, but the assessment is still the same. The unha is capable technically, in theory, to reach the US mainland, but it doesn't look like a weapon, and it is highly unlikely that the whole operation, if it is intended, will work out. You have to see they have been developing that rocket for more than 20 years now. And after 20 years, they had their first successful launch. And if you want to place the fate of your whole nation and your leadership and as a dictator, your life, you have to say, on the success of a nuclear strike with that, let's call it a rocket, I wouldn't do that. It's highly unlikely that it will actually work. And it's not designed as a weapon. From all that I've seen, it's a satellite launcher, as I told you in February. And it's more a political tool. If someone else still thinks it's an ICBM that's capable to hit the US or whoever you want to threaten, well, okay. That's just another bonus in the political arena. But there are so many things that can go wrong if you put this rocket on a launch site and prepare that for a launch as a nuclear attack against the United States that I wouldn't bet anything on doing that. So if you ask me if it's technically capable, yes it is, but it's highly, highly unlikely that they will ever do that.
Before I answer the question, I want to say that all data I used are publicly available. I've sent Asan Institute a full version of my talk. If you are interested in my discussion, you could read that article. The question is about the fourth nuclear test, possible fourth nuclear test. I do not know how reliable the news report was. I have no idea about that part. Before the first North Korean nuclear test, the North Korean government informed China it was going to do a nuclear test. So it would not surprise me if North Korea talked to China that they planned something, right? And China was not happy and stopped that. I do not know, but it's my guess. So that's my first reaction to the news report you just mentioned. My second reaction is that between the United States and China, between South Korea and China, we have had much more interactions, dialogues on North Korea than we see publicly. So it would not surprise me that the PLA and the U.S. military, they have had some dialogues, discussions on how to assessing North Korea's nuclear weapon capability. There is one evidence, for example, Dr. Tsinghua visited China Academy of Engineering and Physics, and the Chinese scientists explained to Dr. Hacker their research on North Korea's nuclear weaponization program. So I would say that there should be a lot of discussions among China, United States, and South Korea on how to assessing North Korea's nuclear weapon capability. And I'm very happy to see these discussions, and I'm happy sometimes to be part of these discussions.
Now we'll collect questions for the second round.
I still need to address the
Oh, go ahead, yes.
I wanted to respond to Ambassador Prakash's very good question. I think that we have more than two options. We can continue on our present course, but if we do, we are taking a risk that the North Koreans will seize the opportunity to do more testing and may return, if they haven't already, to a pattern of nuclear exports. In the past, their export partners have been, that we know of, are Syria, Pakistan, and Libya. And perhaps there are more potential customers in the future, and we don't know. I don't understand nuclear warhead design nearly as well as Dr. Li Bin. So I'm not in a position to weigh in on his presentation, but if we just take it at face value for the sake of argument, if a fourth test is a serious milestone for North Korea weaponization capability, to go from merely a device to a real weapon, then it may be worth our while to try to negotiate that option away. Having said that, I do agree that it is very unlikely that the United States, South Korea, Japan, or other countries will concede on the principle of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that fundamental commitment is going to change in the foreseeable future. However, the strategy that we choose in the near term may change and perhaps should.
Thank you. Yes, can you please identify yourself?
I'm Simon Mundy from the Financial Times. A question for Dr. Schiller. Looking at the North Korean efforts to develop an ICBM, from what I can make out, one of the most important capabilities they have not yet demonstrated is the ability to bring the rocket back into the atmosphere. How significant a hurdle do you think this re-entry capability is going to be for them, and how many years away do you think they might be from that? Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Scott?
Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. I just want to ask Lee Bin, based on his presentation, it really does sound like North Korea may need another nuclear test in order to be able to achieve miniaturization. And so I'd like to know a little bit more about the implications of taking this riskier path from your perspective in terms of what that might tell us about what North Korea's next steps or imperatives might be.
Scott, your question was to Lee Bin?
Yeah. Yeah, what are the implications of your assessment that they have taken a risky path to miniaturization and may not yet have succeeded? How badly do they need a fourth test?
Maybe we'll get one more question and then ask the panelists to answer the second round of questions. Anyone? I have a question to all four of you. Just one simple question, which is, are any of the six-party talks countries outside of North Korea, how much assurance do you have that we will be able to stop North Korea from conducting a fourth nuclear test? What active policy means do we have to dissuade North Korea from conducting a fourth nuclear test if they're determined to do so? But let me begin with you, Dr. Lee Bin, on Scott's question, and then we'll just go down.
I would say that the situation for North Korea, the technical situation for North Korea today is more favorable for North Korea than the time when they prepared their first nuclear test. When they prepared for the first nuclear test, they did not know much about how much fissile material they would have. So based on the fissile stockpile at that time, they did not want to do, or their technical capability would not allow them to do many nuclear tests. But today, they should have more fissile material, or they should have confidence in producing more fissile material. So now they believe they could afford more nuclear tests. So the technical capability would encourage North Korea to do more. And also now they understand the nuclear weapons science much more than the time when they prepared the first nuclear test. So technically, it's more favorable for North Korea to do more nuclear tests. Politically, I believe that the international community, the other 5 countries of six-party talk, have much better coordination today than the time when North Korea did their first nuclear test. So politically, it has become more difficult for North Korea to do more nuclear tests. But if they chose to do that, I believe it would be very useful for North Korea to develop nuclear delivery capability. That also depends on their missile capability. Right? Dr. Lee asked a very difficult question. That is, how should we respond to that? How should we, push them back? I do not have a good recommendation. I have no idea. I give it a half.
Yeah. This forces Asan to invite you again to another conference. Dr. Schiller?
Yeah, let me first start with the question about the re-entry capability. It's a very good question that wasn't raised yet. It's the basic question, where's the big difference of having a weapon and having something that transports a satellite or whatever that was to space and, well, leave it there. It's not only about the re-entry capability, that's difficult enough. You have to have a warhead that withstands the thermal stresses and the accelerations at re-entry. You have to hit the target that you wanted to hit. That's not as easy also. And you have to trigger the weapon at the right moment, before it hits the ground at the best, or at the worst. Depends on your perspective. Well, but you also have to think of the ascent. If you put something on the top of a rocket, especially an ICBM, it will suffer a lot of stress. And if you do have a weapon or a nuclear device sitting in a tunnel and blowing it up there, that's very, very simple in a technical way. You don't have any accelerations, you don't have any heat differences, any temperature differences. The environment is just the way that you chose it. It's a laboratory scale experiment. If you want to be sure that the same thing happens, if you put it on top of a missile, shoot it up into space and having it coming down on the other end of the planet, that's a very, very, very different thing. And I would say that if we don't see any tests that involve re-entry in any way, we can be sure that they don't have the capability yet. Because as I said, in theory, of course it always works. You always design any machinery that it works. But it's always the unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld put it, that go wrong. You don't know what goes wrong, and this goes wrong. And that will also happen with any re-entry vehicle or warhead that the North Koreans want to develop. So they have to test it first, not with a nuclear core, but they have to see if it works the way that they intended it to work. And if we see something like that, that's another step toward North Korea getting more dangerous. So we have to be careful and observe what they are doing. If we don't observe that, it will take a while until they are as far. So, and the other question that you asked was about how we can stop a fourth North Korean nuclear test. I would say just the same answer as Lee Bin. I don't have an idea. If they choose to do a test, I don't see any means to stop them from it. We just have to think about our response to a fourth test.
Joshua?
Thank you. I think you simplified the question perhaps unintentionally by asking, can we stop them if they're determined to do so? The answer is no. But if we think of determination not in terms of an absolute quality, but a relative quality, degrees of determination, then maybe there are possibilities. In my amateur opinion as a student of the North Korean-Chinese relationship, I would say that the answers to that question probably lie somewhere in that relationship. And I've heard too many conflicting opinions about it from people who know it far better than I to venture my own. But that is where I would look for an answer to that question.
Well, if there is anything to stop their nuclear weapons technology development, I'm not sure about it, but international society should should let them know that they need strong and continuous signals about if they do it again, they will get paid seriously. They didn't get paid for the first 3 nuclear tests. Well, look at the Syria.
They didn't suffer the cost.
Yes.
The cost was
yeah. And it should be strong and continuously done.
All right, as we wind up, are there any other questions from the audience to the panelists? Okay, I think we can basically end on time. So for our coffee break, over the next, I guess, day and a half, the Asan North Korea Conference 2013, they're going to be looking into nuclear strategy, the viability of the regime, and of course, its economic situation. So once again, on behalf of the Asan Institute, let me thank our 4 distinguished panelists, and I'm sure that if you have questions, they'll be more than willing to answer them during the coffee break. But once again, let's give a big hand and we'll conclude session 1. Thank you very much.